That's another of the attractions to immigration of our current progressive elites, is because they see people coming from abroad and having no history, and you can write whatever you want onto them.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, author Ben Cobley says progressive ideology has infiltrated every aspect of our lives.
Within state institutions, also the BBC, of course, which is state, have networks of targets about racial quotas for filling positions, even limiting certain employment opportunities to certain groups. And it's all the favoured groups of that system of diversity, which again fits into the progressive system.
Ben says our arts and culture have been taken over by activism.
We've effectively got a very stale art world, consisting a lot of the time of a lot of assertion, just a lot of talk, basically expressing your politics, sort of siding with migrants and refugees.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with author Ben Cobley. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Your new book, The Progress Trap, is out. It's a fascinating, thought-provoking read. Progressivism, wokeism has kind of pervaded our whole society. Why were we so open to it? Why has it been so successful here?
Well, I think before we get into either of them, I think we should maybe unpack progressivism and wokeism, because they're not the same thing.
Right.
I mean, in the book I write about progressivism as a whole sort of collection of ideologies, and even you could say, sort of just a general outlook on the world. Even sometimes I say a sort of way of being, which is quite future oriented, that sees better things happening in the future, and all sorts of things sort of flow from that, and that's really what the book is all about. Wokeism, I mean, again, it's a bit of a nebulous term, but I think we all just instinctively understand what it is, and it's definitely linked into progressivism and that sort of mentality of improvement especially through activist work and power. But like I say, progressivism, I mean, it would encompass, well, it does encompass like liberal. Most liberals are progressive now, I'd say. And indeed, I'd say everybody to an extent, I reckon, is in some degree progressive, just in latching on to certain sort of tropes, you could say, like the happy ending.
Yeah.
Like, we can say what's inevitable, our opponents will get defeated because people will wake up and realise.
That's how it's
always
worked.
Yeah, and that's a basic progressive idea, that things will get better in the future over time.
You start with a chapter about decolonisation. Why is that kind of key to understanding all of this?
Well, the chapter is really, the introduction, it takes us really from colonialism. I mean, the title is, I think, From Colonialism to Decolonisation. So it really takes us on a journey from one to the other, from really in the 19th century, maybe a bit before. Takes a detour into French Revolution, American Revolution, other, Russian revolutions, and how they all have this progressive suite of ideologies in common, and looking to draw out the similarities. So, I mean, I say that decolonisation is really, in a certain way, it's a form of colonialism. It's got the same sort of aspects. I mean, they're looking to decolonise Britain at the moment, for example, which often involves, one aspect is to reduce whiteness, the influence of whiteness with a capital W. And that's very similar, as I see it, to what European colonialism was trying to do. It was addressing the natives of the countries that colonial powers went to, and seeing them as inferior, and they needed to be reformed. And you could say there are there were some, there were some good instincts in that, to, for example, end slavery, other bad practices, cannibalism, all sorts of other things. You could very much argue that some of it was, genuinely progressive, as in wanting things to get better for those countries. But these sort of ideas, they acted as a sort of an excuse, you could say, or at least a reason to conquer other countries and to take them over and to subject their existing power networks. And decolonisation is basically trying to do the same thing in the West now.
So you mentioned the revolution several times in the book, like Mao under China, Soviet Union. Do you think what we're seeing here with progressivism is kind of our softer version of that?
Yes, definitely. I do sort of raise my eyebrows a little bit sometimes when people talk about things like cultural Marxism and, this is Marxism, or this is socialism, communism. Because they have a point, but often the people who are pursuing those avenues, those political avenues, or have those ideologies, they're not aware of it like that. A lot of these people, they haven't read any Marx, not interested, but it's more like a sort of style that keeps, or you could say even various different styles to complicate it, that keep on reproducing themselves again and again. And like when one sort of becomes discredited, then it just sort of pops out in a different way, in a different form, as a new version promising change, and therefore appears as attractive there, but kind of reproduces the same sort of style.
During those revolutions, they eliminated the opponents. That was part of it. How do we see that in progressivism?
It's almost like a natural progression from progressive ideology and the politics that come with it, which attract authority into the self. And if the self is the tribune of all that's good and right and moral and rational, then by default, all those who are opposing the self need to be eliminated. Even you could say, if you want to get properly existential, aspects within the self, need to be combated and eliminated from ourselves. And you have that, in various different forms of communist ideology. For example, with Maoism, the self-criticism that went on. But the same happened in Soviet Russia, and other examples. I think Cambodia, Vietnam. Self-criticism is a major part of it. So, in a sense, you might be eliminating opponents, like actually by sending them to the gulag or executing them, but it's really a sort of a permanent, continuous process of trying to remove all those aspects which are working against, the rightful progress of history and you could say the revolution.
Is cancel culture part of that as well? Like cancelling people out?
Yeah, definitely,
Right.
definitely. Yeah, that's what we call cancel culture. Basically, stopping people from talking, even stopping people from associating. Often, these campaign groups they target meetings and denounce, say, groups of men who might sort of appear together. Because one inescapable aspect of progressivism at the moment, and indeed throughout history, has been the identity politics attached to it.
Right.
So at the moment, dominant progressive politics is, you could say, feminist, pro-trans. Those two can contradict each other. LGBT, the racial aspects. So I spoke about decolonisation and anti-whiteness. Ethnic, religious as well, of course, favouring Islam and disfavouring Christianity, because Christianity in our situation in the West, in Britain, is of the past. Islam is is a relatively new religion here, so it sort of almost naturally politically fits into a sort of progressive framework. And a lot of Muslims, Islamists, they see it like that, and they've latched on to progressive ideology, and they express those ideas in how they go about their politics.
So this is kind of like the in-group, out-group thing as well, yeah.
Always,
Right.
yeah, always reproducing themselves. And of course, this goes back to my first book, The Tribe, where I sketched a sort of system, what I call the system of diversity, of how different groups fit in as favoured and unfavoured groups. And that links very much into progress. Again, if you could talk about race and skin colour in this country, in this place, progress is represented by younger people who are generally of or more of non-white races, generally newer to the country, you could say. So they appear as bringing something new and bringing change, transformation, which is, according to progressive ideology, by definition, almost a good thing.
So you mentioned age there. Traditionally, age and experience were viewed as valuable, and people were promoted because they had more experience. Whereas it seems now the opposite is true. We saw Dominic Cummings recently in Oxford saying he didn't listen to the old ministers, he listened to the 30-year-old cabinet officials because they're the ones with all the power. Why is there this kind of reflection or reversal of age?
And I talk about it in the book as sort of a sort of reversing of our traditional forms of maturity, our idea of maturity. Instead of thinking of maturity in terms of a person getting older and with that becoming more experienced and more mature. In progressive terms, progressive ideology, especially the stronger, more left-wing versions, you're thinking about progress in terms of history. So basically, people who come along later are historically more mature. And what is of the past, the people of the past, are by definition flawed and need to be pushed out the way.
So the newer people are kind of like a clean slate that can be...
Yeah, very much so, yeah. And I think that's another of the attractions to immigration of our current progressive elites, is because they see people coming from abroad and having no history. And you can write whatever you want onto them. And of course, they're real people, and real people quite like being favoured. So it appears as kind of a nice arrangement for all concerned, except for those, of course, like dare I say, you and I, who are disfavoured in this situation. But I think it is important in the politics to think about how we are all sort of led in different directions, and there are possibilities offered by progressive politics, for everyone in certain different ways we could fit in.
We saw recently a politician saying we're a nation built by immigrants, we're an island built by immigrants. How does that kind of fit in with this? It's almost like they're starting history at a later point when more immigrants came to the island and forgetting about everything before. Well,
it's just nonsense, but it's nonsense that's believed in a sense, and I find that quite interesting. When people talk about, say, Labour politicians often use that language, and you often see people say, "Oh, they're lying." But you can only really lie if you know you're not telling the truth, if there's another reality. And I mean, I used to be in the Labour Party for 6 years. And I started to recognise these things. And I mean, these people, they genuinely, for the most part, do consider that they are good people. But often it helps not to look into things, just to sort of to speak the language, talk the talk, use the slogans. Again, comparison to Soviet times, that's what's happening there.
I have a surface understanding.
Yeah, then they're not really paying attention to reality. They can't, in a way. And it's quite striking, I think, when you hear or talk to left-wing people. I mean, when I was left-wing, I wasn't aware what the Daily Mail was writing about back in the day. Because I never read it, and I think a similar thing well, the same thing happens now, even in our network world where it's so much easier to read, say, the Telegraph and the Mail for free, as a left-winger. They actually won't, and that's part of the tribal aspect of it, is not to go there. So with a slogan like "Nation of Immigrants," they just won't think about it. They'll read an article in the Guardian maybe, which will be sort of making some sort of convoluted argument. But actually the slogan itself, it comes from America. And JFK actually wrote a book, I think, called "Nation of Immigrants." So I think it reflects often how British left-wingers, especially Labour Party, they really sort of look over the Atlantic for inspiration all the time, and often just basically repeat what they're saying, even though it doesn't fit this country.
You mentioned that you were left-wing before and you kind of moved away. I mean, what happened to change your views?
Well, this is a funny one, because I like to think that I'm still left-wing in a sense. There's a sort of saying that goes around that, say the Labour Party, I didn't leave the Labour Party left me, or the same you could say with the left. And it's sort of like that for me. I mean, I've always been a bit of a rebel, really. But like I say, I was in the Labour Party for 6 years, and I joined in 2010 because I thought, well, it was about time I stopped sitting in the pub complaining and actually got my hands dirty and, just tried to do what I could. And I did, enjoy aspects of it, but almost straight away I started to see how strong the identity politics was in the party, and started to write blog posts criticising it. And in those days, the Labour Party blogs, they actually allow criticism. It was amazing. But I think after maybe about 3 or 4 years, the main one I wrote for just stopped publishing my stuff.
Right. Do they not allow criticism now?
Well, I tend to sort of sympathise, because, in a way, from their side, is that, you're an institution. Labour Party's an institution, or, a blog being published is an institution. They have the right to choose what goes in and what doesn't. I think when we talk about cancel culture and allowing criticism, and it's a major issue when we look at the whole of society. But we need, everyone in their group, they need some sort of institutions to gather around. For example, media. You could say sort of trade unions, that sort of thing. It's just a natural thing. But yeah, that kind of was one aspect of leading me out of the Labour Party and away from the left. Another was just seeing, as time went on, how strong the identity politics was, and that I didn't like it, and that as time went on, I started to recognise this was getting worse, and there was very little chance of changing it. Then, of course, Jeremy Corbyn came in as leader, who I wasn't at all in favour of. But really the last straw was when Brexit happened, and I looked into it, the issue myself, as I do, like I say, as a contrarian. And I used to be generally pro-EU, pro-Europe, and I just thought, well, hang on, I actually disagree now. I guess I got a taste for rebellion. And then, of course, you had all sorts from the left coming out and saying the most nasty things about Brexiteers. I remember Alan Johnson, the old Labour Home Secretary, and one of the my more favoured Labour politicians, and he came out and said something about the Brexit people being awful and xenophobic and all the rest of it. And I thought, well, if he's saying it, it's gone, it's finished. He's an old sort of working class Labour man.
Yeah. So
I thought, well, time to cut the cord and leave. Yeah. So that was me leaving the Labour Party. Leaving the left, like I say, I don't think I'd have, although the organised left, which I'm affiliated to, basically barely exists. I mean, there are a few groups out there, but not very strong.
In what ways have we seen progressivism kind of infiltrate how the government runs, how the state is run, and things to do with politics?
I think it's everywhere. I write about it in the book as it's like in the existential air we breathe. Another metaphor is in our bloodstream almost, and that goes especially for the top echelons of society. I mean, not just the state, the political parties, but also the business world, charity sector, sports. Basically the whole lot is, as I see it, permeated by progressive ways of being, you could say. Conservative Party, yes. Even you could say nowadays Nigel Farage and his Reform Party. And I think, our state is very much, not just permeated, it's often explicitly progressive. I remember actually a long time ago when I was writing The Tribe, I found one of the civil service recruitment pages saying we are a progressive employer. So it's explicit. But it ties into all sorts of politics. The most obvious example is the identity politics and how they, within state institutions, also the BBC, of course, which is state, have networks of targets about racial quotas for filling positions, even limiting certain employment opportunities to certain groups, and it's all the favoured groups of that system of diversity, which again fits into the progressive system. So yes, very much you could say captured or taken over.
Do you think for those companies, so we see how much they invest in progressive stuff, do you think it comes from looking for profit, and do you think it will end because it stops making profit?
I think companies are generally following fashion, aren't they? And a progressive outlook on the world has definitely been fashionable for the last 20, 30 years, I'd say. So there is an element of that. But of course we've got the backlash going on now, especially in America, where a lot of employers are suddenly going, well, actually all this diversity stuff and all the targets we've had, all the employment practices, they're not actually effective, despite what we said, so we're ditching them. So you could say in that sense they were maybe following a misleading idea of progress and profit, and now they're turning the other way. So things change.
What role has the second election of Trump played in all of this?
I think it's given a massive jolt to everyone, both on the left and the right. You could say sort of loosely conservative versus progressive. It's given conservatives a lot of encouragement that actually you can win, you can change things. Although of course a lot of people are reluctant to back Trump himself. Certainly for me anyway, he just gets on my nerves. But a lot of his politics, for example, to do with addressing what you might call wokeism or diversity practices, for example, in universities, I think, is excellent. I don't know the details, but the general thrust of pushing back on all this nonsense, craziness, is good. So that for me will inevitably and has already pushed over here and given encouragement here. And I think we are seeing quite a few sort of more modern, if you like, dare I use that word, because again a progressive word, modern, organisations sort of building up with a much more sort of new media networked way of approaching sort of, for example, the guys who went on to the Tube and Clean the Tube.
Oh, yeah.
They're actually from this organisation called Looking for Growth, which is a right-wing you could say, neoliberal organisation, but very, very effective tactics. And I think you've got quite a lot of activity going on like this. So people on the right and on the, if you like, the sort of the anti-woke, anti-left progressive side of things are feeling, quite encouraged at the moment. But that's partly through being out of power.
Right.
I think if you look at a lot of conservatives now, they're a lot more comfortable than they were when they were in power, when they were basically, the Conservative Party was in power for 14 years, did very little, let the sort of the permanent revolution continue to work its way through the institutions, did very little about it. Now they're out of power. Well, I mean, they were basically paralysed, as I see it, between, more socially conservative and then the one nation, you could say, liberal conservatives. And now I think I can see the right in general being a lot more punchy and a lot more assertive. And it's difficult to be like that when you're in government and you've got to deal with the civil service and actual policy making.
I was watching the latest Adam Curtis documentary, and it showed the liberal intellectuals kind of taking revenge on the people who voted in Thatcher by taking over the arts, basically, and turning it into this thing that ordinary folk just couldn't connect with, couldn't understand. And this was obviously decades ago. But can you talk to us a bit about how progressivism has affected the arts now?
Well, I think, again, it's just saturated in, kind of unthinking, progressive ideology. But it's partly related to the state and, where funding comes from.
Right,
I mean, subsidy in the arts, this is the wider arts we're talking about, not just, for example, painting. But subsidy is crucial, and it sets almost the terms of how different artists operate. And for us here in, at least England, we have the Arts Council England, and there are other similar groups in the other devolved nations. But yeah, Arts Council England I write about in the Progress Trap, at length, and how it's very much saturated in progressive ideology, how they think about it. And I think one example which may be interesting is how you get a lot of rhetoric from them, and this is how they're setting out to their potential people they're going to donate to, what they're all about. And they talk about how people must be open, artists must be open to the world and very global in orientation. And I write about this as kind of, it's inimical in a certain sense to the process of art, which is individual to a large extent and is closed. To do good art, I mean, I know about writing. To write well, you need to be on your own.
Yeah.
And you need to be in your own space, in your own bubble, and without distractions. And it's, as far as I see it, it's the same for artists and as they call it, creators. You need to be quite closed, actually, in a certain sense, to produce something that's individual, and they're very much against that. It's no, you've got to understand what's going on in the world art scene, and also in the world. So they're referring, again, I talk about this in a lot in the book, towards sort of sociological ideas.
Right.
You've got to understand how society is developing, how art is developing, and what is relevant and what not, which to me is completely different to the meaning of art and even hostile to it. So yeah, that's basically what the Arts Council is all about. And it's there's been a lot of criticism of it, in recent years. But now we've got a Labour government, I can't really see it changing. So this is, but it means we've effectively got a very stale art world, consisting a lot of the time of a lot of assertion just a lot of talk, basically expressing your politics, sort of siding with migrants and refugees, for example. Seemingly, every artist you see and hear is doing that. And, why are they doing that? Why are they all being the same? We think of the artist as someone who's different and individual and is thinking for themselves. And we've got the reverse going on now.
So is it that art's become, rather than being about creating something, it's more about activism?
Yes, effectively. And in the book, I write about, in a sense, how, again, going back to the Arts Council, they say that they're, in one of their major documents of recent years, a strategy document, they say that they're going to stop using the word artist.
Yeah.
And they're going to start using the word creator, I think. And that allows them to start breaking down the definitions between what is art and what is not, to let in a lot more things. And I write about one group, for example, in Bristol called the Rising Arts Agency, which basically received Arts Council money, and they plastered the city of Bristol with these posters saying, "White man, have you been thinking about how guilty you are?" I forget the exact words. But literally just, advertising slogans. It's an advertising agency for, racial progressive identity politics. And the Arts Council is giving this money, a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of pounds. So this breaking down of definitions from art to creators or to culture, they speak about how it allows them to sponsor a lot more, type of activity. And like I say, it's basically sort of dispensing with the boundary between what is an artist and what is not. So you can support basically anything that is reflecting what are effectively bureaucratic ideals. The classic diversity, equity and inclusion, but others too, the internationalism. So yeah, very much, I find this, it's very interesting, but not very attractive. And as you find when you maybe go to an art gallery, so go to the Tate Modern, you'll have a lot of just basic sloganizing, just, the visual and audio equivalent of people shouting at you. And this is our art world today.
So what can we do about all of this? What are some remedies?
Big question, and I have got a chapter on this, and but it's a convoluted and difficult question. I think the basic thing, really, I think, is to think for yourself. I'm guessing people who are watching this are quite interested in doing this. So, read, learn, think for yourself, but also get organised. Crucial, join existing organisations, try and influence them from within, but also set up new ones. Set up your own sort of arts agency if you don't like the art that's being produced. That's easier said than done. We basically depend on people's largesse, money, because state money isn't coming into what I call the rebel alliance. It's quite the opposite. But we need to, people care about their society. They need to put their money where their mouths are.
You mentioned the rebel alliance. How powerful is it? How optimistic are you that things will go the right way?
I think like most people, I veer. 1 minute I'm quite optimistic, and the other I'm absolutely, completely pessimistic. But the fact that there have been a lot of organisations setting up, new media, what you do, a lot of publications, even existing publications, you could say, like, the Telegraph, Spectator, for example, now are very much switched on to all this that's going on. Yeah. And I think we have, over the last sort of decade, maybe developed a language and understanding to address a lot of the worst of progressivism. And along with developing a language comes confidence. And after that, one would hope, comes serious political organisation and eventually some sort of power.
What about the young people, though? Because obviously they're growing up with all of this stuff and it's not that easy to reach them.
I think one thing is to have faith in young people. Not to. I see a lot of people, especially on the right, write off young people. But for one thing, young people, they tend to rebel against what's fed to them. And what's being fed to them is sort of hard progressivism, wokeism. And there is obviously quite a backlash going on among young people. So in them, there is hope.
Ben Cobley, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.